Hello and welcome to Coronavirus Catch Up. I'm Jordan Kenny. We're live on the BBC News NI website and Facebook page and on the BBC iPlayer for the next 20 minutes or so. Thanks for tuning in, however you're joining us. Now, we're currently in week 4 of lockdown here in Northern Ireland, which means, of course, it was review week for ministers. They met today and discussed the COVID-19 situation to decide what the next steps would be in tackling the pandemic. And as I'm sure you'll already know, just after 4 o'clock this afternoon, the First and Deputy First Ministers announced that the lockdown would be extended until the 5th of March. Here's what Arlene Foster had to say about it.
We have made progress, but our war and battle against COVID is not yet won, and our hospital case numbers remain at extremely high levels. So we're asking for that support to keep going. To not press forward would risk all of the hard-won gains.
Of course, we heard lots more at the press conference as well, including updates on the R number and the vaccine rollout. Here to help us unpack it all and, of course, to answer your questions is our political reporter, Jane McCormack. Jane, another busy day. Thanks for coming on.
Hi, Jordan. Happy to be here.
So, Jane, we're staying in lockdown, but under what conditions? Is anything changing about the current lockdown rules?
No, not really. I mean, ultimately, what we got today from the First and Deputy First Ministers and the wider executive was essentially just an extension of what we're currently in and have been living through for the past 4 weeks. So we were meant to finish our lockdown on the 6th of February. I think the majority of people knew that that was going to be highly unlikely that we were going to come out of it then, just given how severe the hospital pressures are at the moment. So now review of that has led to the 5th of March now being the lockdown date. Of course, there's going to be a review then taking place a few weeks earlier than that on the 18th of February. And I think, ultimately ministers felt that they'd nowhere else to go but extend restrictions just given how tough things are. And we heard a little bit earlier from Arlene Foster again, just giving a bit more detail about why they'd reached this decision. And this is what she had to say.
The Executive today has reviewed the current restrictions and agreed that they remain an appropriate and necessary response to the serious and imminent threat posed by COVID-19. And following a detailed outline from Health highlighting the continuing pressures on our hospitals and ICU departments and the emergence of the highly transmissible variants, the Executive has agreed that the current restrictions will be extended for a further 4 weeks until the 5th of March 2021.
And I should mention as well, if you're watching on Facebook, feel free to get involved in the comments section if you've got any questions or anything. I've got my laptop here. I'm keeping an eye on the comments as they're coming in. So if you have any thoughts or questions about what we're talking about, leave them there and we'll try and get to them before we come off air. Now, as we heard from Arlene Foster there, Jane, and you mentioned it yourself, there's going to be a review of these restrictions. But we were told today, the 5th of March, do we have any sort of certainty that restrictions will be eased on that date or even then beforehand?
No, we don't really have any certainty at all, Jordan. And in fact, what we do know is that at today's executive meeting, ministers were actually advised by Robin Swann, the health minister, as well, that potentially next month when they come to review the restrictions, what might actually end up happening is they might have to consider keeping them in place until around the Easter holidays. And we know that this is something that's being discussed not just here in Northern Ireland, but also by other parts of the UK, given how severe pressures are there as well. I think there's a sense that some of the other governments would like to try and keep things as close-knit as they can. Now, hearing that things might remain in place until Easter will worry and understandably cause, I suppose, frustration and anger for some people who have already felt that what we've gone through has been pretty difficult over the past 4 weeks. But it gives you a sense of what the Department of Health and Stormont ministers are thinking about, because they know that while our R number has reduced to between 0.65 to 0.85, we learned that today, so it's fallen again. It is below 1. When you look at the R number for hospitals and the ICU, that is where the real pressure is. It's still above 1. And then you add on the fact that then we still have the numbers of people in those hospitals are 3 times nearly higher than what we had during the first wave. So they're trying to take all of that into account. And that's why we can't really be certain that even come the 5th of March, we will be coming out of lockdown.
Well, what does this extension mean then, Jane, for schools? As things stand, schools are obviously due to be shut until about the middle of February. But what about after that? Was anything said today?
Well, what we got from ministers was this commitment, I suppose, to look at it again next week, because, as you say, the majority of schools are already only open for vulnerable children or children of key workers. So most children are learning via remote learning at home at the moment. So the executive didn't take any decisions on whether or not to keep schools closed until the 5th of March today. Instead, what will happen next week is the health minister and the education minister will get together with some of their officials to work out what can be done and whether or not it is safe to bring children back to school full time for face-to-face learning. Because Peter Weir, the education minister, has been pretty clear in the past that he doesn't think remote learning is a substitute for children being in the classroom full time. But we know that given how things changed over Christmas, and then you add in the concerns around this new variant of the virus, and we know that it is more transmissible, and there were concerns that it could spread quicker within children as well. So they have all of that to feed into those conversations. But you would imagine, given that there are calls from teaching unions already for clarity around this, that they'll have to try and announce a decision on that fairly quickly next week.
And I suppose, Jane, it's a decision that needs to be taken where schools can be given notice before the opening date, because it's not something they can just arrange overnight, I suppose.
No, it's definitely not. And we've heard those concerns from teachers, principals in the past, whenever decisions around reopening schools and even the situations around exams being cancelled or changed at the last moment, that caused real concern, not just for the staff in schools, but also obviously the impact on pupils who have spent an awful lot of time out of school over the past year, and they're not exactly sure what their future is going to look like within the classroom. So as I say, Peter Weir was on one of our radio programmes tonight on Eating Extra, and he was saying that he's hopeful that they can reach some kind of a conclusion on this next week, but we'll just have to wait and see what happens on that front.
And I'm just looking at our Facebook comments here, Jane. We've had one in from Dean. He's asking about the construction industry. Was there anything said about construction today? Is it going to be closed down? What do we know?
No, it's not. And we knew that whenever these restrictions came into place on the 26th of December, it feels like a long time ago now, but we were told then that construction and manufacturing could continue to operate along with the current guidelines. So there has been some concern. You know, some unions, the health unions, have been saying we should have been in a tighter lockdown by now. And why is it that construction, manufacturing and other elements haven't been paused in order to ensure that more people are staying at home in line with the executive's orders? We haven't had any clarity on that as to why maybe they haven't taken the decision. But I suppose what we did learn today from the executive, Michelle O'Neill, told that press conference in Dungannon that the executive weren't advised by health officials that any tighter restrictions need to be brought in at the moment. They seem pretty confident that what we have in place is working. It's bringing the case numbers down, and they just need people to stay the course, in their words, and ensure that, you know, we continue to get things down over the next few weeks.
Well, Jane, we're talking here about more restrictions, a lockdown period that's been extended again, which means obviously then more financial help from the government for numerous sectors. Lee is asking about this. He's asking, how long will we be dealing with the financial impact of the pandemic here in Northern Ireland?
A long time, unfortunately. I mean, we can't estimate exactly the full cost of this, but we know really how severe the impact has been on the economy over the past 10 months since all of this really began to kick off, unfortunately. And even with the likes of the Westminster schemes like furlough stepping in, and then we've had the executive bringing in its own financial support schemes to try and help people. It's just obviously not going to be enough for everybody. And we've even had some concerns, reports of people saying that they haven't received their grants on time from Stormont and that they're not sure when their next payment is coming in. And these are people who haven't worked maybe since, you know, the hospitality industry and retail, obviously, from before, you know, the 26th of December. So these are people potentially facing into months of not having their jobs and not knowing when they might be able to go back and really earn a living. And then you have to add into that as well. The other side to this is, once we do get through the end of the pandemic and Stormont begins to try and actually recover, the draft budget was produced by the Finance Minister, Conor Murphy, this week. And this is essentially a flat cash budget. So that means that Stormont departments are not really getting any increase in terms of their budgets to help them not only recover from the effects of the pandemic properly, but also to try and plan ahead and to invest and start to reform, given that we had gone those 3 years without Stormont being back in place. So whatever way you look whatever way you look at it, it is a relatively difficult situation for ministers, and they know that it's going to be a tough financial time for people as well.
And I suppose then, Jane, younger people who probably have longer working lives ahead of them, are they going to be hit harder, I suppose, by this?
I think people across every walk of life will obviously be impacted. But you're right, when it comes to the likes of jobs in retail or hospitality, and I suppose young people typically have tended to pick up a lot of those jobs that are flexible or maybe are, contract, agency work, that kind of thing. And those are a lot of the jobs that, the sectors have talked about having to cut back on during the pandemic and just not being able to sustain those jobs long term. So that's obviously something that will affect young people. I suppose as well that there's, potentially places for opportunities, because we know that some companies, particularly the IT sector, have done quite well during the lockdown because they've been able to save money. They've had more people working from home. They're going to be looking for skilled people coming out of university to maybe take up some of those roles. So I wouldn't say it's all bad, but obviously for some young people wanting to look ahead to their future, it's been a tough year for them, and I would imagine going forward it's maybe not going to get any easier in the short term.
I see a question in there on Facebook from Darren about travel. We're going to come to travel just in a minute or two, but moving on briefly here, Jane, to shops. You were talking about shops there. There was a lot of chat the other week about large retailers continuing to sell non-essential items during lockdown. I know that Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill met with representatives of the retail sector last week. What's the latest on that? Was there any mention of it today at the press conference?
There wasn't much of a mention, apart from Michelle O'Neill obviously saying that she recognises that it's still an issue. You're right, they had that meeting, the roundtable, with some in the retail sector last Friday. I think the difficulty for the executive as well, they know that obviously some of the larger retailers are selling non-essential items and potentially, in their words, gaming the regulations. And that is going to have an impact on some of the smaller independent retailers who aren't able to stay open because they don't sell any essential goods. The difficulty is the executive doesn't want to get into the situation like the government in Wales ended up in last year, when they defined in law what essential items in supermarkets were. So, for example, they stopped kettles from being sold, and they closed off children's sections, and they closed off clothes sections, and that really caused a real backlash. And I think the executive wants to avoid that and ensure that people stay on board as best they can. So I think ultimately the messaging at the moment is, just because something exists in a shop doesn't mean you have to buy it, because you should only be buying essential goods. But I would imagine we're going to come back to this issue again, given that lockdown is going to exist until at least the 5th of March.
Something maybe to keep an eye on then. But we can't not mention the vaccine rollout tonight, Jane. It's the one thing that's providing, I suppose, a glimmer of light among all this doom and gloom. But Chris is asking about numbers. He wants to know, where are we at with the rollout? How many people have received a vaccine so far in Northern Ireland?
Okay, yeah, and you're right. It is really good news to hear how quickly Northern Ireland is rolling out its vaccine scheme. Arlene Foster today said that 144,212 people in Northern Ireland had, by the close of play yesterday, received their first of the 2 vaccines. So that is really positive news. She was also saying that all people aged over 80 in Northern Ireland should have received their first vaccine by the end of this week. And then I suppose the focus for the Department of Health moves to trying to start vaccinating that next group of the over 75s. And they're planning to try and do that next week. And I think the hope, I suppose, is that by the time we would maybe get to that March period of lockdown, that maybe the most vulnerable people in society, along with people who are elderly, will hopefully have received either one, if not both, of their vaccines. And I think that's really what the Department of Health is looking at then, in terms of thinking about whether or not anything else can be eased in terms of restrictions. But it is good news. Northern Ireland's Department of Health has really managed to roll out the vaccine incredibly quickly compared to other parts of the UK. I think there's a little bit of concern from some people maybe that their relatives haven't been contacted yet about theirs, but officials are saying that they're trying to roll it out as quickly as they can, and people should be patient.
Well, the one thing we all want to know, Jane, is, I suppose, when restrictions are going to be lifted. On last week's coronavirus catch-up, Professor Ian Young, Chief Scientific Advisor, told me that by the autumn time, we'll hopefully have seen a big shift in the restrictions. But Peter's asking for more details on this. He wants to know if there has been any specific numbers or points mentioned that Northern Ireland needs to get to before anything will be relaxed.
Well, if you remember a way back last May, I think was whenever the executive initially started talking about bringing Northern Ireland out of the first lockdown because cases had been falling. And they produced this document at the time called Pathway to Recovery. And in it said that Northern Ireland's R number had to be kept below 1 for a sustained period of time before restrictions could be relaxed. Now, obviously, I mentioned there earlier that our R number for cases in the community is currently between 0.65 to 0.85. So that might lead people to wonder why restrictions can't be eased yet. But what we're told is there are a number of factors for that. I mentioned the vaccine. Obviously, the Department of Health wants to make sure the vaccine programme is well advanced before they start thinking about relaxations coming into play. Then obviously there's also the situation in our hospitals, which I mentioned, because we know that the R number for hospitals and ICU is between 1.2 to 1.3, so it's still over 1. And then I suppose the other factor to play into this is the new variant of coronavirus, because even though our officials here have said that they don't think that it's a relatively high number of people who have been infected with the new variant, they still believe that it is rising at the moment. And so before they can really start to ease things, they don't want our restrictions to be lifted prematurely and us end up in a situation potentially like we have before, where maybe cases have spiked like it did after the Christmas period, which we knew was coming. So that's what they want to avoid this time if they can. So I think when it comes to a specific number this time to look at, I don't think that's something that will happen. I think there's going to have to be a series of factors that come into play, particularly including that vaccination programme and where it is at.
We have a question here in, Jane, on Facebook from Andrew. He's talking about the event sector. He mentions the fact that Glastonbury was cancelled today. We heard as a second year in a row that Glastonbury has been cancelled. But he wants to know what help is available for the live event sector in Northern Ireland, or has there been any mention of that today?
There wasn't a mention of that today. This is something, obviously, that there's been real concern about. I think most notably a couple of days ago, we had Sir Van Morrison, of course, one of Northern Ireland's most famous exports, saying that he was going to start legal action because of how musicians have been unfairly impacted during the crisis. I think the short answer I have is I don't know the detail of every single financial scheme off the top of my head that the executive has. I think there was funding announced by the Department for Communities last year in terms of trying to help the arts sector, but certainly in terms of any announcements we've had today from ministers, because Conor Murphy's announced that there's going to be an extra 100 million to help businesses who are forced to stay closed. To my knowledge, none of that applies to the live events sector, unfortunately. So that is maybe something that ministers are going to have to come back and consider, because we know that obviously there are a lot of events that would usually start to happen towards the summertime. You have the Belsonic Festival, you have other festivals, and I'll just name the one. But there are lots of live music events that will be taking place. And so obviously that's a sector here that will be looking for funding. So we'll try and come back with more of an answer on that in a future series.
Definitely. Jane, I want to ask you about enforcement. There's been a couple of people on Twitter tweeting me about this before we came on. But what's the situation with enforcing the restrictions here? Because there seems to be a feeling among some that there's people getting away with flouting the rules.
Yeah, and we do see those messages coming in from people, and even this week the DUP Agriculture Minister Edwin Poots has said that this is something that he has raised around the executive table in terms of better enforcement and taking tighter action when it comes to policing what he called super spreaders who flout the laws. Ultimately, there are a number of laws in place, and it's the police who have the powers to either fine people when they see people breaching the rules. You can face, I think it's a minimum fine of £200 for breaching some of the rules around not wearing a face covering or being somewhere that you shouldn't be. And they can also close down businesses who are deemed to be breaking the rules. But when it comes to enforcement, the executive has always taken this policy of trying to urge adherence and compliance as opposed to relying on police officers cracking down, stopping people wherever they are and checking on them. Now, in this lockdown, the police had said that there was going to be a visible increase in the number of officers on the streets, just checking things out and monitoring where people were going. But ultimately, I don't think the executive wants to really get involved in this debate any further than they need to. They've said today that restrictions are working. And I think if they can get things down a bit further, then they'll be happy with that, as opposed to trying to take any sort of tighter measures and putting things into law for the police to have to enforce when we know that they've already had a particularly busy period and they don't necessarily have all of the resources to be out there doing additional work.
We had a question in on Facebook there slightly earlier about travel. I said we'd come to that. Travel-wise, Jane, there's been a few changes in the past week or two in terms of what's needed when travelling in and out of both the UK and the Republic of Ireland. From today, international travellers arriving in Northern Ireland have to show proof of a negative COVID-19 test before setting off. That test can be taken up to 3 days before the journey begins, and that's the same right across the UK. In the Republic, since the 16th of January, travellers have had to provide a negative COVID-19 test before setting off. In light of all this, Ewan has got in touch. He's asking about the travel situation between Northern Ireland and the Republic. So do we need a negative test, Jane, to travel between Northern Ireland and the Republic?
No, you don't, because this is something that primarily applies to people coming in via plane or boat, essentially. And also, we should point out that actually there were no international flights scheduled to even arrive in Northern Ireland today, given that we are in the lockdown and all these sort of travel corridors have been suspended since Monday. So it's maybe a moot point. One of the things I would say is if you were arriving into Dublin from somewhere outside of the common travel area and you were then coming into Northern Ireland, there is a requirement for people to fill in what's called a passenger locator form. Now, that's something that you can print off on the NI Direct website, and you are supposed to then present that whenever you arrive at an airport, and that is supposed to help the government just monitor people coming in so they can follow up with them, check that they are where they said they'd be, that kind of thing. I don't know necessarily how well that's been followed up. I think there have been concerns from Stormont ministers that when they've tried to get some of the details from the Irish government on this, that there hasn't been great data sharing, but it is something that what I'm told you are supposed to be doing if you're arriving into Northern Ireland from anywhere, even the Republic of Ireland. You should be filling in one of these forms.
We've had in questions here, Jane. William, Patricia, Diana have all been in touch about this, asking about travel from Scotland, England and Wales to Northern Ireland. Is there any restrictions we need to be aware of there?
No, because we're all part of the common travel area. So similarly with the Republic of Ireland, you don't need to do a COVID test and produce evidence of that before you're coming to Northern Ireland. I think you are still supposed to be filling in one of those passenger locator forms. And I suppose the other thing I would say about all of this is that, we're talking about travel. While there's no, I suppose, specific travel ban from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, even though that was something that Sinn Féin had called for before Christmas, ultimately the guidance from the executive is that we are in a lockdown and you really shouldn't be travelling unless it is essential to do so. They don't define what really is essential travel. It's up to people. But there's another element to this as well, is that no matter where you're coming into Northern Ireland from, if you're staying for more than 24 hours, you should be then self-isolating for 10 days. Now, they say that there are exemptions for people who are regularly crossing the border between North and South or travelling from Great Britain over to Northern Ireland for work purposes or that kind of thing. But other than that, you should be self-isolating, and ultimately you shouldn't be travelling unless you really need to. We should all be staying at home as much as we can.
Okay, we've had this one in from Steffi on Facebook, Jane, on the subject of travel. Dare I even ask the question, but international travel, is that something we could even allow ourselves to consider as an option in 2021, or is it a complete write-off?
I don't know, and I'm not a Stormont minister, so I can't say for definite, and I don't even think they would know at this stage how things are going to go, because we know how quickly our situation can change with coronavirus, but ultimately travel has been a real concern in terms of how the virus spreads. I know that people, are desperately looking for something to cling on to in terms of trying to look forward to booking away and getting to go somewhere again. I think ultimately we're just going to have to see how things go. There've been talk that once people got vaccinated. Potentially, they could talk about having this vaccine passport that would allow you to go to countries and prove that you've been vaccinated. Maybe the travel corridors are something that could be revisited, but that's something that airlines really weren't in favour of. So I think there's a lot up in the air on travel, pardon the pun, sorry. I think it's something that we're going to have to keep an eye on, but I would thoroughly advise people get advice from travel operators before they think about booking anything, and keep an eye on the health advice as well.
Of course. Well, I've got my fingers, toes, everything crossed that maybe, hopefully, we'll get a holiday before the end of the year. We've covered a lot of ground there, Jane. We could have talked a lot longer, but unfortunately, we're out of time. Thanks for coming on, though, and explaining everything to us. It was brilliant as always. Thanks to everyone who got in touch. We didn't have enough time to get back to all of you, but hopefully we've helped make sense of what's happening this week. Don't forget you can keep up to date with all the latest developments on the BBC News NI website, which you'll find at bbc.co.uk/newsni. And we're on social media as well. Chances are, if you're watching this on Facebook, you've already found our Facebook page, but we're on Instagram and Twitter as well. If you just type in BBC News NI, you'll find us on there. We'll be back with another coronavirus catch-up again next week, but until then, stay safe.